Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. We are discussing political parties and talking about how they behave, what choices they make, how they connect to voters, the different ways that they make decisions about campaigns, how to govern. We've talked about their different structures, their different objectives. So far, our conversation has been pretty general. We've mainly talked about questions about why parties play a critical role in what they do and how they function in a democracy. We've talked a little bit about how party association and party affiliation is a useful indicator of institutionalization in a young democracy. We talked about, for example, how attachments to parties in Tunisia associated with different levels of disillusionment with democracy and founding elections. This week, we're going to talk about a new part of this discussion on party behavior, and this is about party voter linkage. We begin now to talk about the different strategic and programmatic and structural ways that parties connect to and mobilize voters in the ways that they represent them in a systematic way, the kinds of strategies they use to mobilize their support and to ensure their continued support in future elections. And as always, this is a really useful discussion because we're talking about democracy and, in particular, accountability and responsiveness to the preferences of citizens. And our starting point today and in this lecture is that straightforward observation that democracy as a political regime is the only political regime where the rules themselves make rulers accountable to preferences of citizens. If they want to be reelected, in a minimal sense, they have to respond broadly or relatively broadly to public preferences. Now, the quality of the representation might vary greatly, and in practice, the effectiveness or the standard of representation might be quite poor. But theoretically, a democratic regime is different from an authoritarian regime in this regard because that critical component, elections and contested elections, introduces powerful incentives that leaders have to represent you and to respond to you in a relatively meaningful way, at least compared to how they would respond to you in the absence of those elections. If, for example, they only had to respond to an inner circle, those powerful elites whose support they rely on to survive in power, but who constitute a very, very narrow inner circle. In this regard, democracy, in theory, is superior, does make it more responsive to citizens, you and I, ordinary people. This is a strong normative argument for democracy. There's this obvious advantage regarding accountability and representation. Now, for us, as scholars, as political scientists, the task is to figure out under what conditions politicians actually answer to you and I, answer to citizens meaningfully. Under what circumstances do they respond in a substantive, material way to our preferences that we theoretically express and articulate at the polls on election day? This really is the key analytical and political problem for democracy. It's not just an academic problem, it's also one that should concern us as citizens, as people engaged in real democratic politics. And for us in this class, at this moment, the question more specifically is how and why do parties foster accountability and representation? What is the role of political parties in promoting these relations of accountability, of representation that exist sort of in the abstract theoretically, and that we can point to as a powerful argument for democracy? Does anyone want to comment on how or why political parties foster accountability in a democracy? What is it about parties that makes them useful in this way? Now, we know that parties are part of political society, right? As institutions, they are not public institutions. Rather, they are organizations that exist in political society. And so, if they function to promote accountability or representation, they do so in a way that is sort of independent of the state or those political institutions that are part of the system, but still help to strengthen the system. So, why is it or how is it that parties do this? Does anyone have any idea or comment on the particular role or function of a party in fostering such accountability?
I guess in certain electoral systems, like closed list, as an example, the parties can determine who runs, or strong party systems can determine the agendas of the candidates that they put out. So that would be the way that they foster accountability of the politicians, because they created the systems which the politicians are using.
Okay, so that's interesting. It sounds like in that example, Ishan, the party is sort of disciplining the candidate or disciplining the individual personalities and sort of shaping their agenda or their strategies or the ways that they campaign or appeal to voters strategically or politically. Is that right? There says if a member within a party votes outside their party's agenda or against the view of the citizens they represent, they could face consequences like not getting reelected. But theoretically, even if the party labels didn't exist and there were no parties, but people had still voted for them, those voters could still punish them at the next elections, right? Even if there were no party labels. So I don't know if parties are essential to that function, but certainly they might help to organize or create the expectations that the voters have regarding how they should behave or what they might be punished for. So the question for us is, what is it that parties are doing that promotes accountability or that creates a framework for this representation? How are they, in particular, representing or responding to voters, the ones who support them, who might mobilize on their behalf or make donations to them, or at a bare minimum, vote for them in the elections? And now we're beginning to think about party voter linkage strategies and the particular ways that parties approach the challenge of reaching out to and reaching voters and in a way that is systematic and in a way that ultimately will carry them to victory on election day. Because remember that Political parties, above all, we define as groups of people who seek to win public office or hold office, and those who support them and help to get them there and keep them there once they do. And so that focus on holding public office is really the defining feature. And keeping that in mind, there are really three sources of accountability or different linkage strategies or different ways that parties connect to voters and engage them in a way that we would associate with this accountability or this representation. And each of these has in common that they are a type of relationship that parties develop with voters. Now, the type of relationship differs in the precise characteristics of the relationship and what's involved in the exchange, for example, differ. But in each of these cases, these are linkage strategies or the ways that parties seek to build support and build constituencies that they can then rely on to win re-election and to build their political party further and ultimately to become a party of government and to hold office and to remain in power. And so in new democracies, the question is, how do parties build and establish these linkages? How is it that they go about constructing their party voter linkage? How do they cultivate these constituencies in an orderly way and in a way that carries them to victory and shapes their political destiny? In a moment later, we'll address the question in the case of Senegal, where we'll take a look at the ways that changes in party voter linkage strategies can sometimes lead to changes in politics and electoral outcomes that are very interesting, but they can be unfortunate and disastrous for democracy. But in general, the question of how parties build these linkages should be in the back of our head as we consider three particular types of linkages in turn. And these are charismatic linkages, programmatic linkages, and then clientelistic linkages. Now, notice that clientelism is reappearing as a theme. And this is noteworthy because we know about clientelism already as a cause of voting behavior in some circumstances where some groups of voters, often exclusively of low income, their votes or their support are purchased by political parties. And a clientelistic strategy, as you'll see, involves this transaction or this exchange. Now, to what degree these different strategies promote accountability and promote representation is the question for us. And this is where it becomes critical that you reflect and think deeply about the quality of these different strategies as linkage strategies, and keeping in mind, in particular, how voters can or cannot exert control over politicians and parties under these different scenarios. So the first linkage strategy is what's sometimes referred to as a charismatic linkage. And this is the simple idea that the connection or the association or the bond is built based on symbolic or personalistic gestures and personal style. And it has to do with developing a rapport with citizens based upon their likes and dislikes and their style or their perspective, their gestures. This is largely symbolic and personalistic. It doesn't relate much at all to programmatic or policy components of political party strategy. It relates almost exclusively to these symbolic components of discourse and strategy. And because it's so focused on personalistic components, it's very, very unstable. And it can vary with the political peril or fortune or dismay of the particular candidate. So for example, corruption uh, um, corruption stings or any sort of large crisis or why am I forgetting the word? I'm sorry, it's been a long day. The point that I want to make is that it's easy to lose the support of people based on symbolic or personalistic linkages if there's a change in the environment or if there's some sort of a loss of popular support. And the Senegalese Democratic Party is a good example that we'll look at in a moment. And one thing that's interesting is that in developing countries and new democracies in particular, charismatic linkages are very unstable because the voters and the citizens are changing a great deal. Economic development and political development, for example, civil society development, can lead to important changes and complex social changes that might outstrip some of these traditional forms of linkage. And parties respond in a variety of ways and with a variety of outcomes. And so the strategies that parties take can often vary, but the choices they make can produce a variety of outcomes. A programmatic linkage is one that has more to do with policy programs that distribute benefits and costs to all citizens. This is really about public goods and public services and improvements in representation through substantive and material improvements in policy that are targeted at not just key demographics or groups, but really all citizens. In this sense, it really is about public goods and public benefits. The idea is that no matter who it is who you voted for, you receive the benefit or the advantage of this party being in power. And this is a good old strategy of policy first. It's a programmatic linkage as opposed to a charismatic linkage, but it's a more difficult strategy because it obviously involves and requires government power and state power and the ability to use public resources to invest in programs that would benefit all citizens. And so, for instance, if you're a new political party, how do you develop a linkage of this kind without access to the state first? And the answer is you can't really. That's why oftentimes new political parties have to rely on charisma or clientelistic linkages or promises of programmatic benefits that will be delivered to all should they become victorious. And so it's no secret then that sometimes it's usually the best and most established and longest running and most successful parties that rely the most on programmatic linkages. And the Workers' Party in Brazil is one example. Although not currently in power, the Workers' Party won virtually every consecutive election for multiple decades, and in the 2000s they really invested many of their political gains in programs that were designed to construct programmatic linkages. And one example was Bolsa Familia, which is a huge social welfare program that essentially pays families to send their children to school. And the program is designed to improve attendance rates at school and therefore improve childhood literacy and education in education attainment rates, but also to reduce rates of childhood labor and also thirdly to channel more income to poor families. And so this is an example of a policy program that was critical to establishing the key constituencies that would support the Workers' Party in the 2000s. Unfortunately, the update to the story is that in Brazil, the Bolsa Familia program is under attack by the right-wing government in power. And the challenge and one of the difficulties of a programmatic strategy is that many of your signature programs that you use to develop those programmatic linkages can be undone easily uh, by a new government or a government of a radically different ideology or political coalition who do not depend on groups who benefit chiefly from this program. And in the case of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, his political support is is right-wing support from often the business community and from groups who don't benefit directly from Bolsa Familia and maybe who don't perceive themselves as beneficiaries of the program. And so the limitation, obviously, of a programmatic strategy is that it, in its use of state resources to develop those constituencies, runs the risk of political changes or policy changes that would undo many of those those tools for maintaining support. And in this case, Bolsa Familia is one example. But a programmatic strategy is perhaps still a better approach than, say, a charismatic linkage, because as I mentioned, a charismatic linkage is very unstable because there can be a change in the popularity of the candidate as well as changes in the citizens and the voters themselves as a result of any number of events or crises. And so it's ultimately better to use a programmatic strategy, even if a programmatic strategy is subject to political change and policy change. There is, however, a third strategy, and the third strategy is one that you've seen already and that you're familiar with. It has to do with clientelistic relationships and relationships of exchange and transaction. In particular, it has to do with those within group benefits that parties will use to attract and maintain the support of particular constituencies, and really those constituencies whose votes can be purchased either with money or with goods or petty consumption goods of some kind, be it beer or drugs or something like that, chicken or rice. But a clientelistic linkage is basically a strategy or a relationship with voters where accountability and responsiveness have to do with delivering specific advantages to them and to those electoral supporters. So purchasing their support. This purchasing of their support, as I mentioned, can come in the form of money for their votes, either on a card or simply through an exchange. It can come in the form of food that's provided, or drugs, or alcohol, or whatever. These exchanges and these transactions come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but the point is they are material transactions. And this implies in turn that there is a need for non-state campaign funding. You need to have some source of money or resources that can be used to purchase the votes of these key groups. And what that means often is that you can't rely exclusively on those same groups for your political support. You need to get the support of some other group in society who can provide you with non-state campaign funding that you can then in turn use to purchase the support and the votes of those those poor groups. And so one example, interestingly, is the Independent Democratic Union, or UDI, in Chile. And this is a party that historically has been most closely associated with the military because they formed in the late 1980s as the right-wing political groups in business class in Chile were preparing for a transition to democracy. The idea was they would create and organize these political parties that could then compete legislatively on behalf of the military and the business class and help to ensure their interests were represented and advanced and defended under the new democratic regime. Well, UDI was one party. UDI quickly developed and acquired the financial support of the business sector and the right-wing conservative groups connected with the Catholic Church. And they would in turn use that money to buy the votes of the poor and working class sectors who were at lower rungs of Chilean society and who could therefore become part of the party's base, but through the acquisition or the purchasing of their support. And in this way, UDI very cleverly developed really two key constituencies that sat at different sides of the political spectrum, or the social spectrum, so to speak. There was, of course, the business and the right wing in the military class on the one hand, and then the lower poor and working classes on the other hand. And UDI then is an example of a clientelistic linkage in this regard. But at the same time, UDI was also very much a party with a programmatic linkage strategy as well, because they represented the business in the right wing sectors with specific policy programs and agendas and items that defended and promoted the interests of those groups. And so the point that I want to make to you is that parties are complex and they identify different sources of political support. And when they do so, they use a variety of different strategies to engage those sources of support and to maintain and to sustain them under the prevailing rules of the game. So UDI is one example, but there are many examples. And before I actually go and show you one example, I'm going to bring up the reading and show you an interesting figure or an example that helps us to better understand these different types. All right, so I'm bringing up the reading and I want to show you a figure that kind of shows you in a three-dimensional way the different strategies and the space that they occupy when we consider the different incentives that parties face. Give me just a moment. So we have three types of appeals or three types of strategies that parties deploy in seeking to build political support and develop these constituencies that they can then rely on to win re-election under the democratic rules of the game. In these linkage strategies, in sort of working as mechanisms for building support, also function as mechanisms for promoting accountability, because under democracy, parties obtain support by responding meaningfully to voters, at least theoretically, right? By accounting for the preferences of voters and responding effectively to them. And so, what is a strategy for building political support is also a mechanism of accountability. And we can then conceive of the different types of linkage strategies or mechanisms for developing support in terms of those different appeals or those different initiatives or ways that parties go about attempting to develop support. So on the one hand, we can think about charismatic appeals or appeals to symbolic or personalistic attributes, characteristics of those things that the voters themselves like or dislike. This is based on the notion that the party has or the idea the party has about what voters dislike or like. There's also, of course, the dimension that relates to the use of selective material incentives. This is the clientelistic dimension that we already know about, the one that refers to that transaction or that material exchange of money or goods for the vote or the support of the voter. And there's also, of course, the third dimension, which is the programmatic dimension. This is an appeal to policy programs or policy agendas or policy agenda items that might effectively represent or respond to voters. And really, there's this sort of space in between where you can imagine all of these different approaches as residing to some degree. And this is what the author in this case, Kitchell, who's probably the best associated thinker with the concept of a party voter linkage, this is where Kitchell is conceiving of the frontier or the space for collective mobilization, or the space where voters can most effectively be responded to or mobilized in a democratic sense. And these three linkage strategies then provide parties with three different approaches to building support. But what I want you to consider is that these might not be equal in terms of how they enable voters to hold parties and governments accountable. For example, is a clientelistic strategy as good as, say, a programmatic strategy? Is a charismatic strategy as effective as, say, a programmatic strategy? These are questions that we'll deal with here momentarily, but let me return to the slides where I want to show you an example of how switching strategies might affect the electoral fate of a political party. Now, when we talk about political behavior around the world, there's obviously a huge difference between advanced industrialized democracies, the ones where, we may center most of our understanding by virtue of being in the United States, in those developing and emerging democracies where elections may be relatively new still, and where a variety of changes politically, socially, economically might be taking place. And what's interesting is that parties have to respond effectively to these changes in the same way that other actors in society have to respond effectively if they are to remain viable politically and if they are to survive politically. And in African countries where there's rapid economic development, in many cases, rapid population growth, rapid and remarkable social changes, the social changes and the economic changes can challenge many of the traditional strategies and many of the linkage strategies that were associated early on with clientelism or sort of pre-programmatic forms of strategy or linkage. And parties respond to these changes by pursuing alternative strategies and by considering new approaches to building support, approaches that may fit better with the evolving society or the rapidly changing political system or environment. And the question that arises for us is, how does switching strategies affect parties' electoral prospects? Are there examples, for instance, of parties making incorrect choices or making choices or investing time in areas or appeals that erode their traditional support and contribute to a loss of support from their traditional constituency? And we're going to actually consider the example of the Senegalese Democratic Party and how the collapse of this party's traditional support as a result of a sort of miscalculation and a switching of strategies led to the eventual collapse and reversal of democracy itself, and the present circumstance, which since 2012 has been one of authoritarian rule. So party behavior and linkage strategies are intimately connected with the survival of parties in perhaps even democracy itself in these emerging and new democracies where political and party behavior are 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 still relatively new, and where there's a lower amount of election experience, as we've referred to it. So in the 2000s, the Senegalese Democratic Party was a effective party electorally and was in power for many years. And they largely did so on the basis of clientelistic practices and practices that involved transactions and exchanges and purchasing the support of voters. These were traditional clientelistic practices that often Excuse me, everyone. I need just a moment. This was a period where it was perfectly effective to use clientelistic and traditional linkage strategies, and they did so quite successfully, remaining in winning re-election multiple times. But this was also a period where Senegal was experiencing rapid and remarkable social changes, linked often to economic development and urbanization, and a lot of remarkable changes that coincided with political changes as well, and the formation of new parties and new alternative options for voters. And what happened was the complex social changes began to challenge those traditional forms of clientelistic practices because voters increasingly demanded policy, responsiveness to concrete needs. They wanted improvement in their lives. And clientelistic exchanges didn't serve those well. And in response, the PDS began to switch to emphasizing charismatic linkages. And in particular, they focused a lot on sort of discourse and items and issues that related to personalistic and symbolic appeals that were often quite heavy and loaded, but were quite empty and hollow in terms of their substance in their actual policy impact. And this coincided with a loss of support. And these linkages began to collapse, and these charismatic linkages showed themselves to be quite frail and fragile and did not effectively carry the PDS to victory in this rapidly changing environment. And by March 2012, the the process really came to its natural conclusion when the PDS, the Senegalese Democratic Party, was defeated soundly by Macky Sall. And in particular, it was Abdoulaye Wade, who was the party leader and had been the incumbent president. Wade was defeated by Macky Sall in March 2012, and this really spelled the defeat of the party. And the rest of the story in Senegal is is quite unfortunate because Macky Sall has really presided over the collapse of democracy itself in Senegal. And to win his own reelection, he's taken to jailing his top rivals. He imposed a new electoral law that narrowed the opposition field to its smallest in 3 decades. And more generally, he has pumped the brakes on democratic development in that country. And political and party behavior, for all intents and purposes, takes place under the purview of of an increasingly authoritarian political system, and competitive elections are harder and harder to come by, and the system as it was is now no more. And what's striking about this is that it shows that there's a link between the linkage strategies of the parties themselves and the success or the failure of the democracy itself, because party voter linkage strategies are mechanisms for fostering accountability and representation. They are that mechanism in function and in the way that they work, because parties in a democracy have to win and retain the support of voters. And so they must represent them in a meaningful way. What the case of Senegal in the PDS shows you is that the PDS made a mistake in choosing to focus on charismatic appeals. They should have instead focused on programmatic appeals and policy driven appeals, where they could focus on the concrete needs and demands of voters and how the party could focus on responding meaningfully to those, as opposed to personalistic and symbolic appeals that really rang hollow when it ultimately came to policy in the material improvements in people's lives that people were calling for increasingly as a result of the social changes. And so what this shows us is in Africa and in Latin America, Asia, and in the Americas more broadly, parties cannot win on clientelism and charisma alone. They must compete on issues and develop policy visions. They have to have actual programmatic substance. And this means, of course, using public resources to develop and advance meaningful policy and to respond to the needs of real people, and to engage in policy building and often institution building in the process. Now, that is a more difficult and more challenging route because that requires a significant investment upfront for what is really a long-term gain. The investment is one that only generates a return over the course of a long period because you don't generate those supporters immediately. You have to first be in power and develop and promote and implement the policies and develop the supporters through those policies. The example of Bolsa Familia, for example, here's an example of a policy that had to be in place for at least a half a decade before the Workers' Party could really begin to rely on that policy as a source of its survival and its continued support. But the case of Senegal is interesting because it's sort of like an example of how parties as actors who make choices about behavior and participation, how their choices can be quite fateful and they can respond in a variety of ways in the circumstances that confront them. And if they respond incorrectly, they could lose support and lose touch with the electorate and be replaced at the next elections. In the case of Senegal, shows that in vivid detail, but it also shows that in a new democracy that's subject to backsliding, the reversal of democracy itself can be the result of that process of failed strategic realignment or strategic switching undertaken by political parties. And so the question that I would have for you is, more generally, but maybe also in Senegal, what role do social changes and party choices respectively play in setting the stage for democratic failure? Is this more to do with the social changes or more to do with the party's incorrect choices? Or is it both? And secondly, and relatedly, are all party voter linkage strategies created equal, or are some better than others? Are some more effective at promoting democracy and accountability than others? Are some more desirable than others? For instance, should we hold clientelistic strategies and programmatic strategies as equal? Or should we prefer programmatic strategies to clientelistic strategies? And then more generally, which linkage strategies are the best and worst for democracy and why? And in particular, should we reconsider the role of traditional and clientelistic strategies in a democracy, or is it perfectly compatible with democracy, the use of clientelistic transactional strategies to develop constituencies and political support? Does anyone want to address any of these questions? What about number two? Are all linkages created equal or are some better than others? What do you think? If the objective is to achieve accountability and representation and responsiveness to citizen preferences, are all linkages created equal or are some going to do that more effectively than others?
Well, in the case of drawing accountability, obviously clientelistic will not hold any politician accountable because they're paying for their votes with money. So there's no reason for them to keep up with the policies other than around election time, whether or not they receive the monetary value in exchange. So that one is definitely worse than the other two.
Okay. Does anyone disagree that clientelistic strategies are less desirable or less preferable from the viewpoint of democracy? Theoretically, you could say, well, doesn't it depend on the exchange? Like, what if the clientelistic exchange is we give you everything in exchange for your vote? I guess then it would be all inclusive, right? It would be, I guess the meaning of that would have to be we give you all the best public policies. We give you all the best in exchange for your vote. In practice, that's impossible. And we know that in practice, the exchange is usually confined to what? Like, a money card, a phone, or food, maybe a chicken or some rice. Usually that's the extent of the exchange, your vote for that. But theoretically, it could be much more substantial. And maybe in that sense, a clientelistic exchange is only different than a programmatic exchange in a sense because it's a difference of degree, not a difference of kind, I guess is one way of putting it. Orlando says, would this apply to only a voting community or all voters? Well, it applies to the relationship between parties and voters because we're talking about the behavior of parties, right? And the strategies that they deploy in seeking to build political support. Class is over for today, but when we begin on Wednesday, we're going to start with the same questions. And so be prepared to contribute. We won't continue until you do. Bye. Yes, Monica.